to start off, and I'm going to ask Chantel to share the GDI website. Just to tell you a little bit about GDI, most of you have a close link to Manchester University, and most of you have studied here. But we have just done a rebranding and a rethinking about where we're going. So, Chantel, if you want to just share that, I'm going to just take it for 2 minutes, show you what we are saying and doing. So if you look at the left side of the screen at our priorities, we want to promote, address global inequities and have a socially just world. And this is the core of our ambition. GDI's core is to have a socially just world, and our core values are inclusivity, responsibility, equity, and sustainability. And you'll see there are 3 priorities: good research, impact on policy and practice, and educating people. So 3 areas: research, impact, policy, practice, and the need is what I wanted to really talk about. The study of the international development sector is undergoing a transformation. Its ideas, its institution, its financing, and its political relations are being transformed. Global inequity, global poverty, and climate injustice have to be more effectively tackled if humanity is to move forward to a more socially just world. So we're recognizing that things that have worked in the past don't necessarily work. So the traditional ideas listed under the challenges there, if we just scroll down a little bit there, the traditional ideas that developing countries would catch up or converge is a very old concept. It's not going to happen. The binary concepts that we had developed or developing, rich, poor, north, south, donor, recipients, are also becoming increasingly dysfunctional. So what we recognize in that the societies have to, of advanced societies, industrial countries, have to go as much change as that of emerging and poor countries in all aspects. So we're looking at how do we look at radical change in personal social norms, and why why should we do this at Manchester? Because Manchester's always been a activist town, city, university. It's been at the crux of the industrial revolution, and we're looking at human well-being and human survival. And we believe we need to answer that question: what comes next? So business as usual, the last paragraph, is not an option. And we have to change the way we do things. And that's why we're having this workshop, is to look at how do we change, add, and inspire our long life learning. So Chantel's going to just cover what we did yesterday in a short summary, and then work you through the agenda for the day. So I just wanted to position what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Thank you, Natalie. So here we are on day 2 of our workshop, and just to place us in context, so we've talked about the GDI vision, and this is relevant because, having gone through yesterday the first 2 clusters that came out of the research, we are looking today on at the consequences for teaching and learning. What are the suggestions, or what are the ways forward that the research we have done are pointing us to? So just to go backwards to yesterday to refresh, and also for those of you who weren't able to join us yesterday, our research with 40 interviewees across many different organizations and many countries gave us insight, first of all, into what motivates people to be in development, and how are they contextualizing or conceptualizing, the work that they do. That was the sort of the context that was in the cluster A, 2 themes. And in cluster B, we looked at what people said was necessary and useful in terms of what helped them to be successful and to make impact as development professionals. So we were in the terrain of technical professionalism, competencies, and also the everyday challenges of leading and managing what they were doing in their contexts, in their organizations. So there is cluster A and B, which we discussed in detail yesterday, and cluster C is what is our vision for learning processes for development professionals going into the future. So just to give a little bit more of a refresher and some more detail, these are the 5 themes that we dealt with yesterday. 1 and 2 in cluster A as the sort of foundational, the context, who people are and what's their thinking. And then 3, 4, and 5, how are they managing the day-to-day struggles, and how are they thinking about it, and what are the kinds of methodologies and approaches to development that are useful. So to say a sentence about each one, theme 1, healers of an aching world, illustrated to us that people involved in development come from a place of being themselves moved emotionally, psychologically, to make a difference in the world, to address injustice, to address inequality, to make a difference, to make the world better. This was so outstanding to us that we wanted to put it there as a basis to inform what we are doing. This is not just a job for those of you who are here, who were interviewed, but across the spectrum. It is something that people are personally moved and motivated to work in. The second theme was about the thinking and the conceptualization of development, and this was about the ever-changing, ever-evolving emergent paradigm shift. So, and there were many of them here. Changes from having very structured ways of dealing with problems and coming up with solutions, to becoming much more systems thinking and engaging with complexity. So there are new paradigms emerging in development, and some frustration with the old ones. Theme 3 in the thick of it was about the development professionalism, the structured ways of doing development, and also the point around one needed to be iterative and adaptive with this in terms of the context that was coming up. Theme 4 was more at a thinking conceptual level on how are people thinking to enable them to deal appropriately with development. So and part of what came out is that kind of linear causal thinking is not appropriate any longer, but really wide systems thinking, the ability to take multiple perspectives, to really work in a situation where other people are seeing something completely differently to the self. And part of this was the ability to be a critical thinker, to stand on the boundary and to be able to critique something and to reflect on something and to question it and to understand that there are different perspectives involved. Theme 5 was about people, dealing with people, the day-to-day challenges of being a leader or a manager in development. How do you cope with all of the dynamics that are in front of you? And 5 major areas came up. The ability to work on yourself and be aware of yourself, the ability to work in multicultural environments and have intercultural skill and sensitivity, the ability to be supported and to give support came up as a really, really big theme. The support of your leader for the work that you're doing, your ability to give support to others. Relationship management was about managing the complexity of multiple stakeholders, sometimes in networks and partnerships. So it's the terrain of influencing and collaboration. And the 5th sub-theme in number 5 was about the ability to work in a team, to collaborate, to lead a team as a dynamic system, not only as a group of individuals. So those were the themes that we talked about yesterday, and we are tackling. So what do we do with that today? So what we would like to do at this point is ask each one of us, Natalie, myself, and Jochen, who were holding the feedback and the detail of each theme, to just say a couple of sentences for what came out by way of summary from the three themes. So Jochen is going to talk about theme number 3, Natalie about theme number 4, and myself about theme number 5. What came up to the surface in a couple of minutes for each one of us as we hold all of the detail of the interviews and the engagements of yesterday. Jochen.
Okay. I would like to speak to two things. And we have distributed about 5 minutes for each person. So it is a little bit of a listening time for you, and I hope you can bear that. I would like to speak to two things. The one is, as you saw in the mission statement of the university, the priority of university is research, which is finding the truth about whatever. A third priority of the university then is teaching, which is giving a qualification. I take that as an example. What comes with research is knowledge, often new knowledge. So what universities often don't do, and that was one of the criticisms from the interviews, a very widespread one, was they focus on knowledge and understanding, and the skills and the practical skilling of students. How, for example, to structure work processes that they should be qualified by this knowledge, that is too little observed. So people come out of universities, and in really practical situations, they don't have the tools, they don't have the instruments to deal with this situation. What is very common in this complex development world is that you have to facilitate groups. Large groups. I did often groups of 2,000 people in Tanzania when we had in communal development. We had to prioritize what does a village want to do and what not. But it's also small groups, teams, and inside of organizations. And how do you facilitate diverse groups to find acceptable priorities? So you have the women and you have the men, and they want different things, and how do you get them together practically in such a complex situation? And how then do you come from priorities to, so that's what we want to do, to objectives? And how do you strategize these objectives in a way that they are resourced, that there are actions following, and that people are organized around this? These are skills, and those skills can be learned very practically, in very practical situations, even in small situations, also in universities. And I think my experience is that universities don't focus enough on them. That's my first example. So the skills aspect. The second example is something that is not so widespread, and it's in the character of the thing, single voices that are speaking as forerunners. For example, naming elephants in the room. One of these elephant in the room here is system. What's a system? And I guess we would have, for each of us, very different answers to that thing. Yeah. And I don't want to go into this, but we had, for example, one voice which was a very strong criticism of the system of macroeconomics being taught to students in development economics, and the uselessness of that system. It's completely outdated because of all the assumptions for balancing markets and blah, blah. Nonsense, doesn't work. We have a skewed economy, and we have always these conflictive developments. So a new theory about systems is a societal systems theory, which does not come from the idea that systems are organisms, which by God or the universe or nature are organizing themselves. A society has a different mechanism to form a system. And what is actually the mechanism? So this is a system of German origin. It came up in the German context that we interviewed, and it had very practical implications. So that theory says humans are not part of systems. You are a family member, but you are a person. And then there's the family, and the family has its own dynamics. And you can influence it or not. It may respond, it may not. The same is, or societies, political parties, whatever you want. They are all systems. And to look at how this system dynamic is makes you, as somebody who wants to influence it, much more on the side. Takes away your agency. You can observe, but you're also part of it. You can stay on the edge. You observe the development of conflicts going into next level of conflicts, and you will never come out of that. There's no balancing. So it's a very foundational, different theory that's not so well looked into until now, not so well received, also not in academic circles because the publishing is mainly has been in Germany, but something that we need to address if we want to deal with complexity. So these two aspects were quite outstanding for me, the skills aspect and the novelty of research that is there and not the mainstream yet. So let's look into these.
Thanks. In terms of theme 4, which was about rethinking, what really came out for me about rethinking is the strong sense that the people who were interviewed, and some of you who are sitting here today were interviewed, but the many people that were interviewed, is that we need a multiple perspectives of looking at things, and the strong desire not to look at it from one worldview or another. So it came out in many, many different ways. We don't look at it from the view of, north and south. We don't look at it with the lens of developed or undeveloped. But all sorts of multiple views. And for me, what was people were saying, we want multiple views. We want our voices to be heard. We want our experiences to be valued. Hence why we also have students here we want students' voices to be heard as we think of what curriculum and future education must look like. But what for me struck is if we need to have multiple views, and the people in development are saying we need to be able to think with complexity, think systemically, think with multiple views, we need to be able to model that in the way that we teach. And how are we teaching? Are we teaching with more set paradigms? Do some people in our faculty and university have a singular mindset? Do we open up to different views? So as much as people are saying we want that, we have to look at ourselves as a university and say, are we doing this? And are we comfortable with shifting paradigms, or are we holding on to them? And I think you can see GDI is aiming to, with a new rebranding, saying we're realizing that things that worked in the past don't work. But, individually, each of us as academics, I speak in this role, we need to say, what is my bias? What is my preference? And am I open to diversity in all aspects in terms of multiple views? So that was one of the overriding themes that came through. And then the other theme that links is the view between practice and academia. And I felt that there's a little bit of an us and them, so that very often practitioners are saying, you at the university do that, and the university people would say, you do that, and we have a bridge. And I think there is so much wisdom on both sides, and we sometimes get it right. We do amazing research when we're working with the community and we've got them involved, but sometimes we don't always get it right. So maybe we publish in a journal that isn't accessed by practitioners, and we don't go and engage practitioners once we've got the research findings. Sometimes we identify research and we haven't heard what practitioners are wanting. So that bridge between practice and academia, we need to have a much closer relationship. And this is part of the process. So that for me were the two themes, multiple perspectives on both sides and closer relations with the bridge. So Chantel, to you, and what struck you your core themes from theme 5?
Yeah, so 100 years ago, some researchers in Germany came up with the idea that the way that human beings behave is because of what they do with the stimuli from their outside environment. And this has been confirmed by neuroscience, that our behavior is a response to what comes at us from the world around us. And this is why we end up as adults thinking in certain ways, because we develop patterns in this. So here in our research over the last couple of months, we've heard people say we need to think differently. We need to behave differently. We can't run our organizations autocratically any longer, for example. And what this means is that there is a plea or a demand for those of us who work in development and for leaders generally to think and behave differently. And that's not such an easy thing to do. So those of us who work in leadership development know that there is a particular way of being as a trainer, a lecturer, coach, etc. There's a way of being that allows people's neurobiology to settle and to move away from known, unconscious, assumed, and sometimes defensive ways of being. And this puts out a challenge to people in tertiary institutions. If you are going to do self-work and leadership work with people in the development sector, self-work, intercultural skills, being able to give and receive support, to be influential, to manage a team, these are all things that are predicated on deep self-awareness and self-work as a human being. You cannot work in a different culture unless you've done work on the cultural assumptions that you carry yourself. So our question is, as we move today into working with what can Manchester or other learning institutions take from this, the question for me is how much self-worth, work and sophistication sits in tertiary institutions to enable this kind of work to happen amongst students and leaders who come to the institution for lifelong learning. So that's kind of the provocation that's up for me at this stage. Okay, so by way of a bit of an agenda, because I realize we hadn't put this out yet, is we're going to spend a bit of time now talking about learning and ask you to reflect on your own way of learning and what has worked for you. And then we're going to look at that theme 6, where the 40 interviewees talked about really practical things that the University of Manchester or other tertiary institutions can pay attention to. And we're going to do it differently to yesterday, because many suggestions came up, and we're going to, in our group today, prioritize them and have a discussion on them. And then we're going to bring that back and distill out some things that the GDI can take away and really start to put into practice. And we hope those of you who head large organizations and are concerned about the development of your people, that there will be something here that you can take to your departments of learning or people development or training. So we'd like to start this process by inviting you to go into a group of 3 for 10 minutes and to reflect back on a learning experience that was really positive for you, where you got something and you then took it and you were able to apply it in a positive and impactful way in your work. So preferably in your work and development, where you had a learning experience that really gave you something that shifted the way you think, the way you behave, the way you do things. And we'd like you to talk about that learning experience and what was it about that that was really useful and made an impact on you. So if you would take 10 minutes in your group, introduce yourself to the other person or persons, and then spend some time sharing this learning experience which made an impact on you and was really good for you. And then we're going to ask you to share some of that when you come back. So Natalie, the groups are opening. Please, move into the groups. You'll have 10 minutes. You'll get a 2 or 3 minute warning before the end. We invite you to share with us from your discussions what type of learning process, facility works for you. What were some of the things you heard, that you experienced, that you discussed in your group? What are some of the learning approaches, facilities, ways of learning that are positive and made an impact with you? We invite you just to share. Maybe put your hand up either like this and wave at me, or put up your little automatic hand and we'll go from there. Mayanka.
Yeah, hello all. I am currently working at GDI and assisting the project with Natalie, Chantal, and Jochen. And I'd like to just give a very quick abstract feedback with the discussion we have just had. So I think the engagement with the community is something which has came out as something very important in terms of positive learning experience in our discussion. And we all agree that the kind of learning we have got through the engagement in the practice. So it's exactly quoted as "you learn as you move," quoted by Phoebe, that you even if you had limited exposure, or even if you have started learning lately, the engagement of the community pushes the practice in you to learn positively. So the positive reinforcement happens a lot with the engagement with the community as you go learn and practice. Especially, it has been highlighted that for the beginners, for the ones who are not experienced, have limited experience, exposures, or learning, for them it really helps to learn it from those who are or who have been in the field, so they can act as a mentor for them. They can learn as you know, either being intern or they have just joined, and they can observe, they can be in the engagement, and they can learn from those. They can look up to them as leaders, mentors, supervisors, whichever way. But yeah, it acts as a beautiful positive learning experience for the one who are actually starting their career in the beginning stages. So for instance, for the workshops, Dora has been highlighting that, you know, she learned a lot during her workshops in her previous experiences, be it methods of World Cafe, learning about World Cafe, or learning about international dialogues, exchanging the collaborations at diverse level during the COVID, learning the real experiences from the frontliners. These all have been coming with the help of community engagement only. And that has been a driving force in terms of a positive learning for her. And similarly, even I have shared the same notion that the way I have also learned has always, by and large, has always coming with the community engagement I have been involved with. Especially learning it from the experience with the wisdom, it helps a lot to identify that, okay, these are the don'ts and these are the do's. And I get an advance heads up that, okay, if I'm going to make a mistake like this, I know my mentor has already made it. So the way they share their experiences gives you the reflection of positive learning, that some mistakes my leaders have already made it, and I think it's better I should learn from them.
Thank you, Mayanka. One of the other groups, Rob.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, what Mayanka said, a lot of that came up in our group. So it was very much positive experience were about participatory research and learning from other groups, learning from other indigenous groups or diverse cultures, and taking things from there that we didn't maybe know before, or that we can then put into our own working practices. Another things that my group pointed out was the ability to listen. Maybe that was learned through experiences, but being able to listen is really important when dealing with a management of a large number of people or various stakeholders. And again, the mentoring and the coaching really came into that. It's really important to receive that, to be able to communicate well. And I think into that comes the whole empathy, being able to listen to others really helps one's own learning and the ability to help guide others if you're in a position of leadership yourself.
Thank you, Rob. And anything from the third group?
Yeah, maybe I can build on that. Yeah, we had a lot of similar themes, as well as, highlighted the importance of mentorship, as well as, I think, practical exposure to things, whether or not that was going on sort of field trips or, getting out there as part of sort of structured programs or just informal exposure to stuff, and the ability to reflect on that. And then also access to sort of expert knowledge to be able to talk about some of those things and reflect on some of those things, and that sort of back and forth between the practical and the discussion and the mentorship.
Thank you. Would anyone like to spontaneously add anything?
Listening to Rodney and Josh, there was also this tremendous sense of kind of growth mindset on their part, which I think is an important consideration. There were aspects of them as people being, exposed, being courageous to new experiences, and an openness. So there were some qualities that I think are really important coming through listening to both of their stories that we need to look for when as we develop people.
Hi, can I just add there as well? And I had mentioned the program that I did in Manchester 2004, 2005, and prior to that, I was in the field of information technology, but I didn't have the notion about how that can enable social and economic development, which is what exactly the program at Manchester was focused on, because it was management and information systems, but changing development. And so it included a field trip to Jordan at the time, which had embarked on an initiative exactly to drive economic development through the use of technology and improve delivery of public services and make the economy more productive and efficient. So I think I've said that to say I think the University of Manchester is in fact well placed because of that long history of the focus on development and making the connection between the technical fields and how they impact on, especially for developing countries. Thank you.
I'd like to add one point that I missed being highlighted by Phoebe, which is somewhere on the theme of the practices, if the practical exposure, if at the right time are not given, they sometimes in the course of your experiences as you grow, made you realize that had I learned this earlier in the stages would have been better. So it's a realization of something, it's a realization of a skill, or it's a realization of an expertise which you thought that you could have got earlier when you studied it, or when you would have had the chance, or if it would have been given to you. So getting skill at the right time and exposure of the practice at the right time is also important, because sometimes in the course of the learning period, you learn those simple things in a later stage, which you thought you could have learned it earlier.
Thank you. Thank you. So we thought it would be useful, since today we're talking about learning, to provide some kind of a framework for us to understand what types of learning there are. And this is one of the points that is quite important in the world of teaching and learning today, is that people learn differently. And there is a beautiful piece of research that indicates to us how people learn. So we thought it would be useful to share this quickly with you in a couple of minutes, and then to reflect back on how this is carried out in our organizations and in our tertiary institutions. So the piece of research that I'm referring to was done by a person called David Kolb in the 1980s, and he subsequently built upon it and is at the moment writing a book on learning and leadership, which will be out, I think, in the next year or so, which builds on the original research that he did. And he said that there are two processes involved in learning. And we are talking about learning in a kind of tertiary institution environment, but he's also talking about it in the sense of learning a new skill or any kind of engagement with newness. So I use this quite a lot with my work with teams. If there is a new policy in an organization or an organizational restructuring, how do you engage with this newness that you are confronted with? And David Kolb has been very clear that there are two processes involved. The one is indicated on the north-south axis on this diagram, and this is the process of taking in information, what he called prehension. It's grasping something. And he says human beings do this in two different ways. The one is conceptually, which is the thinking part. So this is for people who need to understand something before they can grasp it. So it's needing a concept, needing a theory. The other end of the spectrum is people need to have an experience that feels good to be able to learn something. So I have a daughter who, unless she absolutely loved the teacher and was in a class with her friends, she was not able to learn something effectively. She needed to feel safe and accepted. She needed to have a good experience and feel comfortable. I often hear when I run workshops with teams that people say, I needed to feel comfortable before I could learn it, which is very different to I need to understand the logic of this. So that is the one process in learning, how you take things in or grasp things. The other process, according to David Kolb, is the process of processing or transforming that information so that we can use it. And again, there is a spectrum between the people that jump into action. So immediately, if I'm one of these people, I get a new mobile phone, I switch it on, I start pushing buttons and seeing what it can do. On the other side is the reflective observation or the watching, which is I want the guy in the mobile phone shop to do something and I can watch him, then I'll get it. So it's the standing back, watching other people, or jumping in and doing it yourself. Now, why is this important? Because according to David Kolb, combining these two processes in our way of dealing with newness creates different learning styles. So, for example, on the diagram here, you might get a person who has an experience with something and then drifts off and wants to observe and reflect longer. And that person, and I'm just putting a little person up there, would have the learning style that David Kolb has identified as imaginative, which is I have an experience and then I reflect more and I reflect more and I reflect more. It's very divergent, associative ways of doing things. If on the opposite side of the spectrum, if one is a conceptual person and then seeks to put it into action, like an engineer, engineers are often here according to his work, I have an idea and I need to put it into action. My learning style is what David Kolb would call the deciding learning style. So it's about narrowing things down. It's much more convergent thinking. So you can imagine people who are like imaginative and divergent in their thinking, and people who are very decisive, move to action, are actually sort of set up to get into conflict with one another. And in working or teaching or imparting some information to these two different kinds of learning styles, one meets a challenge as a leader or as a facilitator of learning. And on the other sides, for example, somebody who likes to have a good experience, talk to a whole lot of people, brainstorm, engage with people, do walkabouts in the community, and then says, yes, that's what we need to do. That's the initiating learning style up in this corner, which is you get an experience and you immediately see what needs to be done. Down on the right-hand corner, we get an idea and we reflect further on it, is the what he used to call the assimilating learning style is now called the analyzing learning style. And this is the place down on the right-hand corner is the place of traditional academia. And it's very interesting for me listening to all of you here is when you talk about my anchors group, learn as you move. This is about doing the active experimentation. To sit back and learn from others and reflect on others' experience or from a mentor is more the reflective observation. Learning from others, groups and cultures, being in a culture, talking to people is more the concrete experience part of things. And very lastly, the last group talked about, we also learn from expert knowledge, which is more in the lower part of the diagram. So just as a last visual for you, you can see, if you can imagine on this grid here, the north-south axis and the east-west axis. There you get the imaginers, you get the analyzers, you get the deciders, and you get the initiators and the others in between. So David Kolb's recent book, the cover of which is on the screen here for you to have a look at, tells us very unequivocally that as we navigate this world where there's so much newness and so much change, we often start our learning process in a place that's familiar to us. And we need to be met there before we can engage with the entire learning cycle in a productive way. It is important, if I'm an analyzer, to at some stage get practical with that. Or if I'm an imaginer, to at some stage make a decision to move on it. Or if I'm an initiator and I'm jumping into something based on a conversation, there is a point that I need to go and read something about this situation. So just to give ourselves some kind of navigation when we're in the world of learning, we've shared this model with you, and we invite you, as we talk about things going forward, to be aware of what you think your learning style preference might be. Is it theoretical? Is it conversational? Is it sit back and watch? Is it jump in and do something practical? And just to keep that a little bit in the background, and to think about the fact that the entire spectrum of these learning styles, reflecting on something, trying it out, thinking about it, having an experience, all of these are important for holistic learning. But often we need to pick people up at a place which is familiar to them to enable them to move around the learning cycle. So I'm going to hand to Natalie. Natalie, if you would, being also a learning facilitator, if you would like to add a comment that might be useful for the group. And welcome, Suzanne. I see you've just come in. Hi.
Thanks, Chantel. And Suzanne, just to let you know, we'll ask you to just briefly tell who you are in a moment so that people know who you are, and then we'll fill you in later on who everybody else is. Yeah, I think the key thing is to become aware of what your bias is or your preference is. And as Chantel said, you can go to all these different parts. And what I just say, when you do learning, and you say, I have a preference for this, that doesn't mean you can't do it. And the analogy I use is coffee, tea, water. You can potentially drink all of them. You can drink coffee, you can drink tea, you can drink water, but you prefer coffee much more. And so you will always, if somebody says, what can you have, you'll default to coffee. And this is what happens with our preferences. And if we know that, it clouds our whole thinking. So if you are designing a training or intervention program and your strong preference is experimentation, you will design it with role plays and those kind of things in it. If your orientation is some other way, you will design more theoretical things. So we need to be aware, even in our discussions this afternoon, when we put you into groups, that how is my preference potentially influencing what I'm saying? Am I pushing for more role plays because I love active experimentation? So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Natalie. So what we would like to do now is share with you that theme 6, the one that out of the research gave pointers to those of us involved in leadership development, tertiary education in the development sector, teaching and learning. What were the pointers that came out of the interviews that we conducted? And I'm going to hand to Natalie. I'll operate the slides, and we're going to have a look at what came out of that at a very high level, and then invite you to have some discussions on it.
Thank you, Chantel. If you want to pull up the slides, and then I'll talk to the slides. Theme 6, we've called it Lean into Learning. And what Lean into Learning is that this is really about change, because learning is about change, learning is about adaptability. And what came through is our interviewees suggested that teaching and learning be based on a clear set of principles. And I'm going to highlight the key principles and go through at a fairly high level. But that we actually, when we go into teaching, we need to be aware of our own worldviews and what our philosophy is and how we approach development. Over and above the principles, the second thing that the interviewees came up with was there's definite content that is needed in the work in the development field. But the largest and the biggest area of input was people using the methodologies. How do we do this? How do we actually ensure that the learning takes place? And that was the overwhelming theme, with people having many ideas. And you'll see when I share a couple of quotes, you might see people's learning preferences coming through. And then the last part of the theme was, how do we market this? So we've got principles, we've got content, we've got the way we do it, the how, the methodologies, and then how do we market it? So to the next slide, I just want to share a couple of the key things. So somebody said, let's think about, what do people really take away? And this came through, we were trying to choose quotes that typify many views or many opinions. Universities teach content and they forget process. Focus on the process, how you're doing it. I think narrative conversations and an excellent moderator, that is where the science lies. Downloading and dumping information is very 1960s. The university shouldn't do this. And I just want you to think, because after we can have a break in a short while and then come back and work in groups. But, what's the role then of the university lecturer, researcher? Is it just a moderating role, or is there any content role that they play? But this was a strong feeling that we just, they forget process. Another person said, do you need specialized skills beyond the professional background of being an educator or a planner or an engineer or an organizational development consultant? My answer is yes, you do. The professional background of different specialists highly coincides with different worldviews and different personalities types. So do you see development as a mere pedagogical task of changing people, or do you see it as a task of changing an entire system in this world, including changing technologies? So a really important thing was that people were saying, we need to think about these different worldviews and how we present education, because people are coming at it from different perspectives. So is it just about preparing yourself for how you deal with a much deeper complexity? It is that, but it's about cultural understanding. It's about self-mastery. And this was an overwhelming theme, that we need to know how to manage our emotions, how to manage people, relationships, work with conflict. And outside the realm of traditional university teaching. You don't find that in books. And that was to the point that Jochen was raising earlier about skills. What does the world of leadership need right now? And are we really preparing those people? And are we not just trying to teach them to be successful, but in the traditional sense, it's to be successful as a person? Because if I'm together as a person, able to be resilient, able to handle complexity, able to think, to be emotionally collected, it will help me in the service of the mission of development, and it'll be consistent with the ethics that we need in the sector. So you can see that this whole leaning into learning was going beyond content and going into the way we do it. Moving to the next slide. This is now what I would call the table of contents, and it's what we're going to discuss this afternoon in groups. But the foundational principles, people say we have to, as educators and as students or participants, learners understand our worldviews, understand how are we seeing things before we actually even begin learning. We need to understand complexity, and how do you make sense of complexity, not just understand it as a concept, so you can understand complexity theory, but how do I manage complexity? How do I deal with all these different competing values and all these multiple perspectives that come through and that tear me in different directions? This is a foundational principle, and again, I use it with both teacher and learner. And then the need to teach from different perspectives, that we actually need a multidisciplinary integrated teaching approach. And the really overwhelming principle was teaching must be context-based, relevant and future-oriented. And people gave practical examples in the quotes that they did. And an example would be, it's no good just talking about a case study that was done 10 years ago. If we're going to look at a case study, make it live. Go in and bring in somebody from a country right now as they're working in the field. Bring in a community member from the community, from a village. Bring in the development agency. Bring in the head office. Bring in the HRD and talk about it in real time. Make it relevant to what we need. Relevance came through. It's got to resonate with me. And then also, don't just think about what am I dealing with today. What is it that I could do differently? Think outside the box. Think for the future. Think what we may need and how we're going to need these. So it was really important from our interviewees that we don't disregard context. And it was hearing the voices of everyone, valuing the voice of the village person as much as the voice of the CEO of a global NGO. Teaching must allow space and time for meaning making and integration. So many people said that because of the busyness and time issues, that there isn't space. And so the way in which we teach and how we teach, we need to ensure that we build in space for meaning making, either journaling, reflection processes. And so that was really important. So these were principles that should underpin, and in the opinion of the interviewees, our education. The next slide shows the content. And there were many, many specific examples, but these were the broad themes of content. And the biggest theme was leadership and emotional intelligence. If I had to look at, the pages of quotes that related to this and the pages of quotes that related to other areas, I would say that leadership and emotional intelligence maybe took up 65 to 70% of the quotes. So it was a really big teaching content area. We need to teach people how to be more emotionally intelligent, how to manage conflict, how to listen to other people, how to have difficult conversations. Then the thinking skills came up. We need to teach people about complexity, organizational development and HR skills. How do we develop and grow organizations? How do we or don't we manage performance? How do we actually ensure that our organization is strategic? How do we build the organization? How do we make decisions? What do we do? We've got all this information, and it doesn't matter which sector we're in. If we're in macro grant sector, or if we're in migrant management sector, how do we make these decisions? We have to make decisions all the time. Gareth said he was happy to be here because he's been in Ukraine. We're dealing with Ukraine for the last 3 weeks. But how do you make decisions where your resources go, which resources go, which is a priority? How do you make them? Communication, conflict, influencing, change management. Change is happening all the time, but how do we actually manage this? And then a very interesting one, I think quite strong in the development sector, was resilience, stress, and trauma. That very often people are experiencing huge stress in the work that they do and seeing huge trauma. And that specifically, we need a skill set or a course or a knowledge or understanding of how do we process and manage our trauma and stress. The systems thinking, which Jochen has spoken about before, and different people saw systems in different ways, but we need to think more systemically. And then the very practical project management that we discussed yesterday. So these were some of the content that emerged in themes, and we've put them into these themes. The methodologies were, as I said, the largest section. How do we become more, we want education that's facilitative, interactive, and engaging. And people gave very many examples. And they said, we want to be able to have conversations. They shared times when they had conversations. They shared how discussions were important, how a space to be with like-minded but yet diverse people helped their learning. And it came through so strongly, and I link it just to some of the stories that you shared now with Chantel, how learning through others and with others is important, and not learning just through the lecturer and the content, but the experience of actually learning together. Very experiential, saying we want to be involved, we want role plays, we want interaction, and so it was an extension of some of the facilitator style. And then bringing self into the courses. Self-management, emotional intelligence need to be fundamental parts of all programs in terms of people needing to manage themselves. A strong desire to not be top down or enforce things, but kind of co-create the course material. There were examples given of places that had done that, and universities that had actually come in, put the students into the room and said, okay, what is it that you want to learn, and how do we create this agenda? And that is another tension that we have to manage with a university, which says you have to have upfront predetermined learning outcomes, assessment processes, and then how do you manage the university's system with the need for co-creation? But people are saying we have things that we want to bring in. We want to bring in our life experiences. And there was also in this theme a lot about relevance, and that teaching staff must have relevant experience, not just be an academic, but have had some experience in their life or current experience working in field, need to draw on the participants. And then comes through the reflective spaces, which was a principle, but was also a methodology. We need to design education that allows us to reflect. And 3.6 on the next slide, practical, must be practical. We want to be able to take it back. We want to be able to use it. And this brings in some of the stuff about skills, not knowledge. And so just some repeats of some of the themes. And we need to be rooted in evidence in our own city. If we're talking about how do you uplift poverty, how do you deal with issues, what is happening here in Manchester? And are we as the Global Development Institute also having an impact on homelessness in Manchester and looking at working with that, or as an example? Very strong thing was about immersion experiences, things like internships, being placed where you could observe things, going into an organization, observing how they plan, how they manage projects, observing leaders, exposure. People spoke so strongly that how they had grown in development was through exposure to different situations, and that you often only get a multiple lens of life and different perspectives by seeing different things. And we had Rodney talking about his study tour at Manchester and going across to Jordan and then seeing things differently. So exposure and travel. but also sometimes immersion to a particular project, being placed there as an intern, going across and working on a project, and having a sense of community, learning from each other. 3 or 4 more, and then we almost done. Ongoing support. So support was really important for people, that you often have the training and you have something happening, but do you have the support afterwards? So it was like, training can't be an event that happens once and then you go off. How coaching, supporting people, mentoring, application support if people are working on projects, supporting them and reviewing them. What was also really important is peer learning. Couldn't we learn from other people? For example, many of the people we spoke to were CEOs, CFOs, directors of organizations, and they'd love to have a network of other CEOs or other directors and meet in forums and learn from one another. But also younger people were saying if we could just connect, and those networks would vary. Sometimes people were saying, I'd love to be networked to people across the globe. Others were saying, I'd like to be networked with other women. So it varied, but it was, we learn through a group, through a community, through peer learning. And then strong theme about we need to recognize diversity and not try and learn in just one space, one world, because we can learn from each other. So the recognition of diversity in a global world and respecting that and understanding it from all aspects. People spoke about language, worldviews, age, gender, race, sexual orientation. There were a range of things that people gave as examples. And then the debate was online and face-to-face. And many people said, well, I could do some online, could do some, but what came out was that we'd like blended learning. We'd like to have an opportunity to come through and meet each other, connect with people, and then continue learning process online. So it wasn't very much an either or, but for the most part, a both. We'd like both of these in the same space. Length of courses. Most people were saying that they don't want short courses. They don't really have a space. They're not sustainable. Unless there's a very particular niche and a particular focus, then you might have a short course. But for the most part, people were saying we want it over time. We want to be able to embed our learning. We don't want to just come or 2 days and then leave. And then the other aspect is that the research that comes out of education needs to be relevant for ourselves and for our work and our partnerships. So that was another thing that was important. And then the last thing, people said, who are the target markets and who are you marketing? And there was so much diversity on this area. And Jochen will talk a little bit later about this. He's going to drill down into that one specifically. But it was just that, are we targeting the right people, global people, people in development, people in senior leadership? If you don't have the right mix of people in the course, then you cannot necessarily learn as well as you could if you had the right sort of people. You can still learn from one another, but the selection and who comes on the course or program or intervention would be important. So this is 3 slides that I've taken about 15 minutes to go through. But it was several hundred pages of dialogue. So, yeah, thank you. Any comments or questions before, just like maybe your quick 1-minute reaction to what I said, 30-second reaction. So Suzanne said it's interesting. Any other comments? Was it what you expected? Was it different? Just can put in the chat, or if you want to prefer to say it verbally, that's fine. Okay, well, a lot of information.
I have a question about length. I was surprised. There's always a tension around what people say they want and what they're actually willing to commit to. So I was interested that people wanted, said they wanted long-term courses. So I'm just curious if you could shed just a tiny bit more light on what
Yeah. So what they were saying is they can't give a lot of time at once, but what they want to do is rather have short courses over time to embed the learning. They found that a one-off short course, if you go to a 3-day training course, as an example, on digital leadership, and you have 3 days on digital leadership and you go back to the workforce, you don't always embed and implement that because you haven't had time to make meaning. So it was something is needed to be supported. And it wasn't always that they necessarily need more input. Sometimes it varied, but is that maybe I could have coaching support that would look at this. I did another study on another university where we looked at it from the students' perspective. Here we were looking more from the community. And that program that I interrogated and researched there, they had a model where they had over 8 months, 3 times 3 days of workshops or training. They had an overseas experience where the group went overseas for 5 days to a different country, a study tour. They had individual group sessions once a month for an hour with a coach at their own time and discretion for 8 months. And they had 3 group coaching sessions in the 8 months, one at the beginning, one at the middle, and one at the end. And so that's a sort of way of design, that it wasn't a design that you necessarily had a week, a month, for a year. It was kind of a flexible design, the examples that people gave. So it was the learning is there, but it's not necessarily always in a course. So the learning must be over time to embed it.
May I ask one other quick question? I think it's quick, which is related to this. And I'm sorry, Rodney and Gareth. I hope this. Do you mind if I just ask one more? Well, okay, thank you. Is related to, you said, after a couple of, if it's short, going back after a 2-day course, it can be hard to bring it back into the organization. Did it come up at all about sort of the difficulty of being the sole person from your organization taking a course and the desire to have multiple people? Did you already talk about that?
No, I haven't spoken about that, but that was some of the people that shared an example and said, I'm the only person in the organization, and if I go on a short course, I come back, it doesn't make any difference. Chantel was involved in a very dynamic program with Auditor Generals around Africa, where they had to send 4 or 5, wasn't it, Chantel, 4 or 5 from the same office into the training. So we had 5 people from, each country's Auditor General's offices, and that helped embed it. So it could also be in the design like that. That did come up. Okay, who was next? Was it, let me just...
Gareth and Rodney.
Okay, Gareth.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, it's all very resonant. I mean, I'm sitting in a big institutional sort of international NGO, and it all just felt very familiar and very kind of, correct in a way. The thing that really struck me, and you did dwell on it, was the sort of the leadership and emotional intelligence being such a dominant part. And then the long list of stuff that I read as kind of teaching people how to just sort of manage the brutality of modern institutional life in late modernity, which was quite jarring, actually. But the list of 9 other points constituting sort of 30% versus the big fat one at the top, and that strikes me as really pertinent because it, the sort of, I look at my staff, I look at the intergenerational rupture that's occurring around, kind of how people see the world, and there's this kind of ecosystemic humanistic desire that people express all the time, and it's expressed as a tension because the institutional reality is so far from that in the present. So there was something in what was being described as sort of like, you need to prepare everybody, especially more entry-level people, for the brutality of institutional life as they will find it, because that's going to be jarring. But actually what we really need to get people towards is sort of almost rebelling against that in this humanistic ecosystemic sense. And I see that all the time. And then there's a related point here about the neuroscientific, the neuropsychology, all of that. In my organization, I coach a lot of people who are just brutalized by the task positive hypermanagerial nastiness across everything, and it really hurts them, and it really, you know, and then when you start talking to people about how they can free themselves from that, they suddenly become sort of settled and more peaceful, but they don't like each other. The social domain and the task positive domain in the brain, as Boyatzis, I think, was the study using functional MRI scan, showed, they really cancel each other out. And so there's a lot here around that I think bears huge amounts of, because it feels very foundational in the way you described it. You know, we could go down the wrong path and just prepare everyone just to succumb to the dominance of the hierarchy and the management too easily.
Absolutely, beautifully summarized the tension and the dilemma there. And, you know, I think it echoes, you know, what people were saying, you know, so that it was, I mean, I could spend hours just showing you the quotes. We will share this document with quotes, because when you read the quotes, it just like hits you, you know, it absolutely hits you what trauma people have gone through. Rodney?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to speak in terms of and it arose because of the discussion about duration of training. And one of the reasons I chose Manchester is because the 12 months was actually just a sort of right time frame for me to be able to, you know, take off from work and focus on that. But one of the things that came out in terms of training was the intersection of policy development and advice with the policy making. So I think most of us on the call develop and advise on policy, but we don't actually make it. And therefore, in terms of fundamental changes that need to happen, and usually that falls within the domain of politicians, so ministers of governments and prime ministers, who we advise. And I've had in my career the opportunity to act as a permanent secretary, for example. And if you're in the Commonwealth system, you understand permanent secretaries as CEOs of, you know, critical sectors within the public sector. But you would also understand that you know, developing policy and advising on policy doesn't mean that policy will be taken or policy will be implemented, because there may be a disconnect with some political agenda and so on. And therefore, one of the things we've sought to do, and you're not going to get a minister or a prime minister to sit in a training room to be taught. And therefore what we sought to do is do sort of like seminars, awareness building of some of the key issues. And that helps in terms of their ability to accept sound policy advice and their ability to judge the soundness of that policy versus their own political agenda. So I think in terms of training at that upper level for policy makers, that awareness building and short-term interventions would also be critical if we really want to make a shift globally. Thank you.
And I think, Rodney, just to add to that, is that if those workshops happen, the point that Gareth made earlier is, was there a growth mindset? You know, is there a growth mindset or openness? And if it becomes that seminar is too much of a tell-in, we lose the impact, you know. So it was very much about how do we build up, trust, build up the right environment that they were open to it. So those were the things that kept coming out, not so much. So when there were a couple of people, and Mayanka also was very involved in analyzing this theme, and particularly looked at the short courses and long-term. And there were a couple of, in the detailed analysis Mayanka did, where somebody says, yes, I do want a short course on HRD or something. I don't know if you want to just add, we need to break shortly, Mayanka, and we're running out of time, but maybe in like one sentence, the thing that you noticed about the short courses versus longer courses.
Yeah, so to answer the length of course, the distinctive feedback came that there is a direct relationship between the length of course and on which position the learner is. If you are in your top of your career, then the length of course does matter. You would not be able to dedicate your time much as you would have done when you were there in your early of your career. So it has came up as a collective way that there is no problem with the short-term courses, or there is no problem with the long-term courses. The problem is the right time, and it was which position you are at and how much time you can dedicate. So we need to identify those courses, for instance, just a certificate course for a week where even someone at the top of their career can invest time rather sending someone else on their behalf or a junior, because there has been a quote where someone stated that they have sent their junior on behalf of them to attend the course. So these are the reflections on the length of courses over there.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We're going to have a lot of in-depth conversations now, but we're going to break for 20 minutes, or is it 15 minutes, Chantal? Just guide me. 15 minutes. So we're going to have a 15-minute break. Jude will come back to your question just after the 15-minute break. And we'll continue, and then we're going to be putting you into groups to actually deeply engage with these topics and capture things that we can take back to the University of Manchester and say, this is the voice of the development practitioners and students. This is what they're saying. This is what we hear, and share with other leadership development consultants like Suzanne, who are doing other work. So we'll come back, and we haven't forgotten you, Jude. We'll come back to you in 15 minutes. Nobody in our group wanted to be the scribes. I said I would feedback, but I've really asked Dora and Phoebe to interject with their voices. Jude, as I said, has gone to fetch his children. We came up with, well, they came up, I'm the voice for the group, but they came up with two areas that they were particularly, or three areas that they were particularly passionate about. The first area was structural. How do we get people into the university system that don't have pre-university degrees? So people who have a considerable experience, who've worked really well, but who didn't study at university, but you want their knowledge and you want them to be, they're leaders because they've been working in the field for 15, 20 years. And so the university makes it so difficult sometimes with recognition of prior learning. So how do you bring people into the university? And equally, you've got young graduates who studied and never ever got work experience. How do you get organizations to do internships and give them energy? So that was item number one. Item number two was, how do we deal with stress and burnout personally, and what skills do we need to have individually, and how does our education system prepare us for that? And then the third one was, how do we make coaching and mentoring part of an educational system for sustainability? So those came irrespectively from Dora, Phoebe, and Jude. And then as we discussed it, we picked up that sometimes there's resistance to every one of the items. There's resistance to changing the structure at a university. There's resistance to internships, resistance to people wanting to mentor because they don't have time and they don't think it adds value. So we moved on to a discussion to look at, how do we deal with resistance and how do we deal with change? Because the problems may be different, but if we want to change something and we want people to have coaching and mentoring, or to change the structure. And so we had a lot of discussion around that, and Dora shared a really nice story which I've asked her to share to the group, but her key thing was we need to often share a story, and that's a success story, and then you might have a pilot. So we get change with small successes and small stories. And Jude shared that, you know, we need to make sure, and Phoebe, that people see the benefit to this change. So if you want to change a structure of university, getting people to come and study and they haven't got the formal qualifications, but they got 20 years, what's the benefit? If you want to get coaching, what's the benefit? We spoke also about individualism versus collectivism, that we're often in a mindset of thinking, what could the individual do? But that really, it's the collective. Passion of individuals to change, persuasive ability, and having a different experience. And Dora ended with saying, purely because I've seen the benefits, I do it. but how do you convince people to give it a try? So Dora and Phoebe, I'd just like you to add your voices very quickly before it's only my voice there. So anything you want to add? I did the big summary. Phoebe? Or Dora, you come up, Dora, you got your screen on?
Yeah, yes. No, I just want to add on the issue of the graduates who've never experienced the world of work, together with the ones who've been working for over 20 years and now would like to get a qualification, that there can be collaboration at that level where they are together. Maybe they are studying for a master's degree or some postgraduate, program, that you could already, by having them together in one class, where the ones who've been working, who don't understand the academic way of conducting research and things like that, and I gave an example, then can learn from these young ones. But already the young ones can start to learn about the reality of the work, and that even though you study all these concepts, when you get into the real work and you start to apply, these are some of the issues. And I was saying that could start already opening up opportunities for these young ones to already have relationships with these development organizations, where they could maybe go and spend an hour a week or something like that, purely because there's already a relationship that would have been built at the university during the academic sessions. So that's the one bit that I thought I would be able to add, but otherwise everything is perfect. Thanks.
And Phoebe, just to add your voice.
Okay, thanks. You captured everything we had discussed. However, I think when we were discussing about the resistance to change and how we can deal with that, the challenge is how to communicate value, because different people value different things. And we were talking about how you have to understand who you're communicating with, what is valuable to them, and then trying to adapt that to try and help them be more open to doing things from a different perspective.
Thank you.
Okay, we had a very similar situation. I didn't even ask if somebody wants to take notes and speak. So I took notes, and I'm quickly going to report back if that is okay with the three of you. Yeah, is that fine? So we had a discussion about how to have hands-on experience, how to get in touch with what is happening on the ground and sharing that, and connecting it also to the theoretical background, and getting mentorship and learning on the go. So we come up with three quite practical suggestions. The first one was regarding secondments and practicals and internships and mentorships. The idea was it shows a motivation and passion if you go for it or if you offer it. And out of that came, could students in their selection process from the university already be asked to be open to become mentors as alumni if they got a job later? And out of that came the very clear answer, yes, people who have been alumni, who've been through university, would possibly be offering mentors, to be mentors. And the concrete proposal to GDI is, why don't you do a survey among alumni, whether they would be able and willing to offer internships for students, and see how many there are, and see what can be organized. That was number one. Number two was the question of staying motivated in a field where the impact of your work is not so easily seeable. We had discussions on how do teachers support the insecurity of students in the beginning And the answer to that was, whoever teaches at the university needs to have a versatile choice of didactic methods to support a group formation that builds trust. Trust in the group is giving people the security to open up and also become open for learning. So model trust building here in classes so that it can be taken up in the later work life by the students who come out of here. And that's a special skill that you need to have to observe the group and how to build trust. Last point was the impact point. So how can we know that we're impacted by, that we are impacting our customers, our clients, the people who we work with? And the suggestion was, why don't we turn this impact question around and say, how are we impacted by our stakeholders? For example, by doing research about the stakeholders and their situations. As we have just demonstrated to all the interviewees that we had in this survey, using this method of dynamic inquiry. And it links up with an approach to finding solutions in reiterative processes, where one comes back and says, where are you now at with your problem? And what is the next step? So it's more of enabling stakeholders to find the solutions than finding the solutions yourself. And the practical suggestion that I then made was to say, if it is helpful, we'll teach this research method of DI. That can be learned quite fast online. And we can offer that as an alternative way of doing questionnaires where you have a presupposed hypothesis. Here you get surprised by what comes up. Rodney, Supidi, and Mianka, please add.
I think you've captured it. You've captured the essence of our discussion, and for me, it was there are a couple of things repeated in the previous presentations. You know, the idea of mentorship and secondments to institutions and calling on the alumni. And I think, I mean, one of the things I mentioned, which I think you put across maybe is the passion. This I think, because one of the things you said is that a similar survey conducted in the private sector was quite different in terms of the volume of responses, even though it was a larger group. So they certainly are working in a more complex field, and a lot of us are, in fact, you know, highly motivated in this specific area, and how can we make an impact? And it can't necessarily be taught in the classroom, but it can be learned almost by osmosis in those same mentoring and internship facilitating that knowledge exchange for people who are passionate about it. I think passion is contagious, and I think if it can't be taught, I don't think it can be taught, but certainly it can be learned in a real environment. I
think you said everything, but I was more passionate on that point about impact. How as a professional, sometimes it can be frustrating that you don't see the impact of your work. And that's because we don't get the chance to, you know, speak to our clients after offering the service that we give them. And then I also thought about university impact. Is the knowledge that you're providing your students really making a change out there? I mean, you spoke about how GDI wants to make radical change, impactful research, and all of that. And I think that universities should invest more in like finding that out, connecting with professionals, forming those relationships, having those networks, and just, you know, keeping that going, just to make sure that you know that you're making a change beyond just our alumni working at the World Bank. So yeah.
Thank you. Mayanka.
Yeah, I think I'd like to go here with the points you have briefed, apart from the points which Natalie in her group also stated, that how do we handle the stress? How do we break the structures, the convention structures? I think to answer to how do we handle the stress, coming from a very personal experience, I would want to just highlight the point that stress at workplace or stress at learning places can only be handled with the wisdom of the mentors. They really teach you, make you believe that this is just a phase and it will pass out. All you have to do is just be courageous enough to handle it. And this is what we are discussing again and again, that this is what emotional intelligence is you're getting prepared for. So you get prepared for these kind of emotional intelligences because you have had stress. And because you have had stress, it can only be guided, mentored, and channeled by your supervisor, by the mentors, by the people who are experienced and have a lot of wisdom. And how do we break that? I don't know. How do we break those structures? How to break those structures? I don't know. I'm still trying to figure it out on my own.
Thank you, Mayanka. Thank you. I hand over to Chantal.
Well, I'm going to hand over to Josh because I wriggled out of the reporting back. But I'm very happy to chip in, Josh, because you said we had this very divergent conversation and Josh said, oh, there were some themes. So off you go.
Yeah, and then I got handballed the reporting. So none of us really took notes, but so yeah, the others can all chime in after I've rambled for a bit. I think in general we focused on the sort of importance of emotional intelligence, and sort of branched off from that in different areas in different ways. Talking about, for example, even just the importance of different energies that different leaders can bring, how those might impact differently, how those might be curated and identified. I think we talked about the importance of psychological competencies and capacities, and how sometimes those are obviously important throughout an organization and one-on-one and all that type of stuff, but at the senior level often can be lacking, or even non-existent. And even if it is, they're rarely talked about explicitly. I think we talked through a number of ways that organizations might be defensive and how those could be navigated. So whether or not that's reactions to new ideas, or people, organizations being reticent to change, or ignoring management. We also talked about briefly undertaking work on issues like racism, and how navigating the defensiveness around that, as well as how that work might be done in a way that's safe. We talked a bit around psychological safety, and where that might apply or might not apply. And yeah, then we also talked about ways to structure. So if improving psychological competency and capacity is important, how can we structure that within an organization? And so we talked about models like Gestalt or IFS, or leveraging systems like that, and their technologies and the pros and cons that might have. We also talked about structuring the culture itself, to, for example, have more reflective processes in it, or a greater willingness to question or to share, or to be vulnerable. And then towards the end, we also talked a little bit about younger age groups, people who are in their 25s coming into organizations, and some of the uniqueness they bring in their own sort of way of being, as well as how do we train those that demographic to to upskill. And one of the things we talked about was the importance of simulations, or how simulations can help in breaking down some of those more idealistic views of the world in a way, but also sort of speeds up learning and exposure to situations without necessarily having to put them into real life situations, or relying on that being an option. I don't know, that's my scatterbrain remembrance of what we talked about. Guys, what did I miss? What could have been said better?
Suzanne, do you want to add? Thumbs up, thumbs up. So I think what was interesting is that we didn't really talk about the sort of teaching and learning part, apart from talking about how can we, if you like, upskill the younger generation really quickly into all of the stuff that the older generation has learned by trial and error with some kind of pain and difficulty. And we talked about simulation as one way of doing that. But I think what stood out for me was just in navigating going around this territory of fear and the culture of organizations and understanding psychology and the complexity of it all. This is not easy stuff. This is not like learning, I nearly said mathematics, but I'm quite sure there's some maths professors that would kind of object to that. But yeah, this is not easy in terms of supporting and developing people to cope in these environments. And we had Gareth in our group who was talking about he has to go off and deal with the devastation in the Ukraine. So it was very real.
What do we do with this now? Is there anybody who wants to add? Is that enough? Has somebody come up for you while you listen to the feedback from the others?
I think the one thing that came up that I don't think I reported back from our group was they spoke about the importance of relationships. It came through very strongly that if we're going to, as Josh and Chantel were talking about this world and the challenges, and Mayanka was talking there about how hard it is, we just kept talking about it's only through relationships. And it's like this space where you get to know people, and other spaces, but where you've got support. So I just want to add the importance of relationship came up in our discussion.
Anybody else?
I think we did mention this, but and one of the other groups talked about resistance. But I think the things that we're talking about are quite revolutionary. They resonate with us, they make sense to us, but they're quite revolutionary in terms of the systems that we're bumping up against. So I was just aware that there was this talking about resistance, and we were talking about, you show up at the sea level and you say, you need to consider trauma, and they look at you and think, oh, you again on this thing that you're always talking about, so it's just come back to me that this is not easy work to venture into this and to think about the development sector is asking for change, and it's not like flipping a switch or saying, oh, we'll redo the curriculum next year. There's something very challenging about this.
The other thing that strikes me is, you're looking at people's learning styles, and there's, when I think about the design of how you deliver these and the experience, it's a lot of, I don't mean to reduce anything, but it's a lot of boxes to check to be able to engage people, all different people with different learning styles. And so to create, to make the case cognitively to people who may be skeptics, as you just said, or may not think it's important. So to be credible to people in a certain way, to create a lived experience for people so that it's felt in their bodies, to upskill so that they actually walk away with something practical, to make it relevant to their locality and their areas of interest and impact, and to extend it over time to have multiple modalities of peer there's a lot of asks and a lot of needs for this to be to work across a diverse group of people, and with time constraints, with financial constraints, and with skepticism, or just people not connecting with people unless certain conditions are met for their own learning needs. And so it's for any topic that's true. And then you add something that like trauma, or like some of the things that, Rodney's bringing up, or others that, are not a given to people. You're already sort of you're kind of asking them to take a leap of faith. And so it just feels, I just feel the complexity of all of this right now.
I can actually quote a very much model existing to reflect on what we are discussing here. So the university that I was working back in India is sort of trying the same experiment, where they are at conflict with breaking the structure and the full of aspiration leaders who want to bring the contemporary changes. And there is a tension between the university, between two ideologies, where one side of leaders, or one side of the people who are intellectual, they kind of reflect that this is not the way. We have been doing it from ages. How are you challenging these theories, these fundamentals, these ideologies? They have been coming from the generation. Now suddenly you are coming with all these innovations and changes you're trying to bring. Where is learning happening? So the very much model in the university currently do not have any conclusive finding, because it's there. It's existing to struggle to come either on the convention side or on the side of the contemporary. But as you are rightly putting it, it's complex right now, because it has given me stage to do a lot of experiments. And I can say that with confidence that I have been successful with all my contemporary experiments I have done. But at the same time, I have been challenged to be crazy to do those experiments, because those are no longer conventional. They did not accepted the hierarchy being horizontal. They are still following those vertical hierarchy, that faculty has to be, with these dues. You cannot be in a certain way with the students. Flattening the hierarchy is something we are not going to accept. How are you doing that? Either you're becoming too friend with them, or you no longer be a faculty to them. But then at the same time, I got the reflection, being confident, when I got feedbacks from the students. Someone is in Cornell, someone is in Australia, someone is somewhere, and they are just sending these messages to me. And then this was the validation to my method, that, okay, I know few people are doing the convention way, but being leader, I know I have got the validation for my method. But it's a very complex procedure. So many boxes you have to tick.
Thank you, Mayanka. Thank you. Great example. Rodney.
Yeah, thanks. This is just a thought that as I was listening to the discussion about an impact on the development sector, specifically the University of Manchester, and beyond the classroom and what we're talking about. It was mentioned about it's not just simply changing the curriculum, but what came across to me was in terms of what else can be done, because we're talking about addressing issues of global inequality, which of course we're talking about changing the status quo and so on, is the issue of think tanks and providing thought leadership at the global level, driving the discussion about this whole issue of inequality and the reasons for global inequality, facing the hard truths, because these are very complex, as we talked about complexity of the issues. These are complex issues, rooted in so many things. You know, if we talk about it from our own perspective in the Caribbean, colonialism and all of that exploitation. So it goes beyond, you know, even in the training. There are fundamental issues that need to be addressed if we talk about addressing global inequality. And therefore, in terms of providing thought leadership on this issue, period, and maybe, I'm not sure if there's a think tank in the university that specifically was formed to address this issue, but I think that could go a long way. Even as we think in terms of, like I said, changing the status quo and theories of power and global power, global inequality and exploitation and stuff like that. So thought leadership, think from, you know, developing a think tank that is inclusive, that, you know, obviously with voices from developing countries, from disadvantaged groups, from women, from everyone really, who has a stake in the game, and maybe out of that as well could come some solutions. Thanks.
Thank you, Rodney. I feel reminded of we are talking about development and we are development. And that is what is reflected here. It's not only the complexity out there, it's the complexity in here, right here. Chantal, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to move us into the close. And before we get to the thanks and the acknowledgements, just to give us a bit of time to assimilate some of what we have experienced with each other today and also yesterday. So I would invite each one of you now just to take a moment. You might want to make a note and think about, what are you taking away from this conversation today, and if you were here yesterday? What are you taking away that's of use to you in your work? And we have a second question for you, which is, do you have a last message for GDI? Make a note of it, and I'll ask us to speak these out in a moment. A last message to the Global Development Institute. Okay, so as we close our workshop today, and as we close the two-day process, we'd like to hear from each one of you those two statements. What are you taking away that's of use to you in your work? And secondly, what's the last message you'd like to give to GDI after this reflection and these conversations? So I wonder, whoever would like to start can start, and we'll just put up hands after that when you're ready. Who would like to start?
I can go ahead if
thank you, Rodney.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the takeaways for me is that in fact, even having the discussion here and with the diverse group is it's helped for me to gain a better appreciation that really what I'm doing here in the Caribbean is part of a bigger global conversation that is going on, a bigger picture, and so on. Sometimes that gets lost in the day-to-day, you know, as you work in the trenches, as it were, that in fact there's a bigger discussion that is taking place about global inequality and development issues, and you know, really that they need to place a greater emphasis and focus on collaboration with like-minded stakeholders, and build this, you know, strengthen the network of those persons in the, like yourselves, who are working in the development, and maybe can help to, you know, clarify my own thinking and help me to take different approaches as I engage with our here in this neck of the woods. I think so. That's for me, is even just having a conversation around it was good and refreshing, and helped me to gain some additional insights and perspectives. And I would say that in terms of messages, certainly we want you to share your findings. Really, I think maybe that's a given, but certainly we want you to share your findings and the key outcomes of these discussions that would again help to further, and maybe build on this group in any way that you can, perhaps to have a subsequent, at the appropriate time, interaction again based on your findings.
Thank you, Rodney. Thank you. Who would like to go next? Sapedi.
Okay, yeah.
Sapedi, then Mayanka, yeah.
Okay, I don't know if this is related to this, but like usually in development, I'm very, very skeptical about this field, but this conversation and this research has just made me hopeful, you know, about the future. I'm glad to see this happening, and this just shows that, you know, universities or academia have a role to play, you know, in the development sector, and I like to see it. Before I thought their involvement is just to provide the education, the theory, but I think this work can really be impactful, and it's really good to see. And just my message for GDI is just to keep the work going and develop this research further and continue extending the invitation to us students. It's good to be involved in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayanka.
Yeah, so my takeaway would be the most difficult task in what we are doing with the kind of purpose and objective we have with the help of this project is very difficult, first of all. And second of all, that we are glad, I'm delighted and lucky and feeling fortunate to be part of this project, because prior to this project, I used to feel that I must be crazy in the field of education, doing all the experimentation. And whereas I mostly encounter with those who would like to take the smart and street smart shortcuts. So maybe I'm alone, but no, I think sharing the like-minded thoughts is very important. And to encounter, meet, share, learn, hear from these experiences in the diversity is very, very important. So this is my takeaway, that I'm no longer alone, because there are like-minded people like me who are still experimenting, be it academia, be it industry. We all are trying our level best to keep it up. The second thing I want GDI to do is connect all of us on a forum. We would want to share our stories. These voices are very important, because these changes can happen at the individual level, but it will be more impactful when we do it at collective level. The collectivism in these changes is very, very important.
Thank you, Mayanka. Thank you. Who would like to go next?
I can jump in.
Josh.
I think so many takeaways, but even just the simple overview of the theme 6 and all your dot points, like for me, that was a great takeaway anyway, because I just felt it was a really beautiful outline of the key context relevant to development learning. So even just that as a list to me was useful. But yeah, and obviously the discussions have been super rich and exciting, and I have so many notes that I'll need to go over, little thoughts that I've written down and compile. So yeah, my message, yeah, I similar to what others have said, yeah, just feel super hopeful, super excited, and super, yeah, lucky to have had these chats with all of you over the last few days. I think my message would be just, yeah, keep working on this, and to explore the praxis of this stuff, the applications of it, getting down into the, like, all right, how do we leverage all this stuff into the practical outworking, and whether that's building something or finding partners that are doing the stuff you've identified as important, and tying in with them. And I think the other thing that I thought of through this was how much I think universities are important in this particular space, in this particular sector. I think more so than, for example, in commercial leadership programs and that type of stuff. I think universities have a bit more, yeah, I just think they can make a bit more of a significant contribution to the development space, more so than maybe other sectors. And that was just my own opinion and thought I had listening to you all. That is all.
Thank you, Josh. And I'll go to Phoebe because you turned your camera on first, and then Dora, and then Jude. Phoebe.
Thanks. While I wasn't very familiar with the project from the onset, it was easy for me to follow through the discussions since yesterday. And of course, I appreciated listening from others who've worked in the sector for so many years. So it was a good opportunity for me to hear from them and learn. So I'm grateful that the invitation was extended to the students. Perhaps an additional message, it would be good to see more collaboration of such work with the practitioners themselves.
Thank you. Dora.
No, thank you so much. I think for me, the takeaway is, I mean, the whole process, right? From the interviews, from the just really reflecting on my work and my learning and the practices and all that, because we don't get time to be able to sit still and really go through that. So, you know, it is so needed. And I think, again, just the interactions, really knowing that, you know, we need to pay attention to, you know, development learning, to learning in the development sector. How are we learning? How would like to be able to learn? I think it's something that I will take away also into my work in terms of, you know, yeah, learning. How are we learning? How would we like to be able to contribute, but also how do we like to be able to receive that learning? You know, and I think we are also not static. We are evolving. I think also the opportunity to be able to talk to other people is something that I would take in as well. Always check in with other people within the sector, because there may just be some other, you know, 1 or 2 things or 4 that you may learn that may be able to assist you with your work. In terms of the message, I would like to encourage you to do more of these. I know it means a lot of time investment. It's one of those catch-22 situations where you wish you knew before in terms of what you're going to be able to get out of this. But you know, I really would love, I'm very much interested to hear where this initiative is going to go. Just like someone who just said now, you know, very keen now on each person here. You know, what work are they doing? I saw quite a number of people from South Africa. You know, is there even a chance to actually take, you know, talk further and understand further now that we know that, you know, in terms of, you know, we are in the right frame of mind as far as some of the issues are concerned on leadership and other things like that. So I'm really, really very keen for something like that. And I don't know if that's the role that you guys can be able to play for us. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dora. Jude.
Yeah, let me thank you. Sorry I came in late. I took permission initially. First, I will start by talking about what this means to me, particularly the program. And first, I'm quite glad that there is global conversation around how to advance education, leadership, and development across the world, and people are thinking, not just thinking, making out time and effort to see that these things work. And this platform had provided for me an opportunity to now have a robust understanding on how people think, how people approach issues, and how they feel differently in their own respective places of work, and how they think that change can be effected, and the steps that can be taken to effect these changes. But where I would want to add a form of summary, like what Nuji has said, I think there is need for us to continue to expand this conversation. There is need for us to continue to expand the conversation, identify more critical stakeholders that are going to drive this process, more critical stakeholders that are going to drive this process, both in the field of those that are going to practice it and those that will drive it too. It will be key that the practitioners and the drivers are on one page to understand it. But the summary of it is, I would say that yesterday and today have been so fantastic for me. I wish this time could continue because I have gotten to learn and met new faces, understand how people think differently and they feel differently, and the approaches to issue too. So I thank you all, and I say I have taken more than enough from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jude. And before I hand to Natalie for the close, Jochen, would you like to make a closing statement?
I thought about giving the same message that the participants gave. And from my side, I would say I'm very excited in participating in this development initiative that has been sprouting at GDI. And I'm aware of the high weirdness level that I sense, because I do not know enough about the system here in Manchester that the initiative is trying to influence. So I'm curious to see which conflicts come up next, and there will be. So my message to GDI is, you are in the thick of it all, which means development. And I wish you the courage of vulnerability. And I personally offer to be an accompaniment in this process.
Thank you. What is sitting with me now as we come to the end of this process of these two-day workshops is my memory of many of the interviewees who I had conversations with, who said something along the lines of valuing a place and a space to reflect with other leaders, other people involved with the same dilemmas and challenges. And in a way, that's what we have allowed, or we've given space to these last couple of days, is for the variety of you with your experiences to come and exchange and share. And this is what I'm hearing as you check out. So many people saying, we'd like to do this again. We'd like to be reminded that we're not alone, that we can talk about stuff, that we can meet, that we can share. So in a way, I think that's something of a challenge, Natalie, to the GDI. Maybe there's a space to create a community of practice with some topics, or with an open space, just where we can come and talk about what it takes to work in this very complex and challenging environment, and where we can get support. And I know that Gareth went away today with a lot of support and a lot of ideas and a lot of energy that will help him to support his organization in the work they're doing in Ukraine. I think we did a great service to that cause today by having Gareth with us and letting him leave with some energy and some inspiration. And I think that that's something we can do for many of us that are in the trenches, as you said, Rodney, in the trenches, that we need some encouragement and some connection from time to time. So Natalie, hand over to you to do the close.
Yeah, thank you so much to every single person here, and people who are not here that contributed to the research. And we've had a whole lot of emails flooding in for people who couldn't attend, saying, please send me the recording, please, I want to be there, sorry I'm not there. So the people are actually present in the space, even though they're absent, they're wanting to engage. So I think that is saying something about the energy that's here. I personally feel such a, I think it's gratitude and appreciation for this process, for Chantal, who drove the research, who did many of the interviews, and then who realized the complexity and level of them and brought in Jochen to support it, who then we brought in Mayanka, brought in myself, but just to realize that about a year ago, it was not quite, but about May last year, I sat down and I thought I want to have more engagement between practitioners and academics. And I saw this project pop up and say, there's funds for a research. And I went and said, I want to do research on engagement between practitioners, and put forward, and then, approach Chantal. and that it was a twinkling of an idea, a spark of an idea of something that I knew I felt, but I knew many other people were saying it and feeling it and expressing it. And to see us all sitting here and talking about results and where we could go, and still a long way on the journey, but we're on the journey and we are talking, and that just makes me feel, I suppose the word's happy, makes me feel happy. So I'm really grateful and happy. And yes, there's a lot of work ahead. There's, papers, there's articles, there's a thought that I had while we were talking is I would love to capture some of the things that you've just said and create a video to share with some of our academics, because we'll get your permission before to share it with them. But I would say, you said words that, Rodney, appreciation of a bigger discussion, it's very difficult, I feel like I'm no longer alone, so many things that I think it would just be good for them to hear those nuggets, not the whole, they can hear the read the report. So I've got ideas of how we can do it, the community of practice. So, I would say we're signing out, but, watch this space, you will hear more. And so thank you to everybody for your energy, for your authenticity, for your commitment, and really looking forward to engaging with you on this journey in the future as it unfolds.